chose to join us tonight for the first ever virtual community night. We are calling this event VolunTRUTHism, a conversation on ethical volunteering. We're so excited to share this topic that has really been on our heart from the beginning of the semester. When we first started brainstorming ideas on what our community night topic would be, we kept coming back to wanting to share how we can best serve others, both domestically and abroad, especially in times of crisis. And every time we would stray away from that topic, something would lead us back to it, and specifically the disaster relief portion. We truly believe that this conversation was planned up by God from the very beginning. We didn't know that we'd literally be in the midst of a global crisis when it was time to share this topic, but God did. And I know that a lot of us have been looking for ways that we can be helpful in this time, and I hope that our presenters are able to give you a little bit of advice on how you can best do that, both in this time and in the future. So, for those reasons, we are so excited that we're able to share this information with you tonight, and I hope that you're able to learn something valuable during it. Before we begin though, I wanted to share a couple of things about this event. So as you're watching, feel free to interact with us. We want to make this experience as engaging and interactive as we can. So if you have any comments as you watch, please use the live chat feature to post those. Also, if you're interested in receiving 2 free continuing education units for attending this event, and you're a social worker, marriage and family therapist, licensed mental health counselor, or if you have an addiction or child welfare certification, stick around until the end of the event and we'll provide some direction on how you can receive those. Also, if you're a student and your professor is offering some extra credit for attending our event, please just stick around until the end and we'll provide some more information on how you can get some extra credit, because we all know that we need a little boost here at the end. So, with all of that to say, I would like to present our speakers for the evening. Tonight we have with us Dr. Steve Pullis and Brian Burr. Dr. Steve Pullis is the Community Events Senior Director for Convoy of Hope. He is passionate about connecting churches, organizations, and government agencies to serve the impoverished, suffering, and marginalized. And he does so with the support of his beautiful wife, Melissa, and their 2 sons, Nathan and Colin. Our other speaker that's going to be joining us is Brian Burr. He is the International Director of Kenya, also with Convoy of Hope. And he works specifically with the Kenya Assemblies of God, alongside his wife, Kimberly, to facilitate programs that lead to transformational development. So we hope you enjoy the rest of our evening together, and here is Dr. Steve Pullis and Brian Burr with a conversation on ethical volunteering, moderated by our professor, Julie Kuhn.
Welcome to Southeastern University's annual Community Night, sponsored by the Social Work Program. This event is solely created, coordinated, and implemented by senior students in the Social Work Practice with Communities and Organizations class. We are so very proud of their efforts, especially during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. They have learned the value of flexibility, patience, resilience, and persistence. We hope that this educational platform will help shed light on the truths of volunteerism. Dr. Pullis, Mr. Burr, could we begin by having you tell us a little bit about the mission of Convoy of Hope and the respective roles that each of you play within this agency? Mr. Burr, we can start with you.
Sure. So I serve as Convoy of Hope's director in Kenya, in East Africa, and we have an office based in Nairobi, but we work all over the country. Convoy of Hope has a number of offices in different countries around the world. We have 4 in Africa currently. The one in East Africa, we work very closely with the local church, specifically the Kenya Assemblies of God Church. They're our primary partners in Kenya. And so my role is to oversee the programs of Convoy of Hope in Kenya and make sure that we're connected to a larger entity that's going to be there long after we are. In our case, it's the Kenya Assemblies of God. So we focus on disaster response and mitigation. In other words, to lessen the impact of reoccurring disasters like droughts, flash floods, and things like that. We have some community development things that we're doing, initiatives that are also connected to our program centers. Our program centers are places where we provide food for children in our children's feeding initiatives. So over 3,000 children a day in Kenya are getting a meal through Convoy of Hope. We have women's empowerment programs where women are starting small businesses through a training program that we do. We have a curriculum. The women go through 6 weeks of business training. And for many of the women that we focus on, the poorest of the poor in the community, for many of them, it's the most education they've ever had. When we survey the women in our programs, we find that most of them have never been beyond 3rd grade. So it makes quite an impact in the community. But anyway, we have agricultural programs that we're instituting in all of our program centers as well, so that we're building sustainability into what we're doing. But our primary focus is to partner with the church so that all of our efforts are pointing people to Christ.
Great, thank you. Dr. Pulis.
Yes, I serve as our community events senior director, lead our team, where we help local communities conduct events which provide short-term relief, but also connect to long-term services. So really trying to be a catalyst to help people who are in poverty, and our target on these outreaches are the working poor, help them take that step up. And the big key there long-term is connecting them to those long-term services that are already within their communities and enabling to help them. On the note of volunteers and some of our topics today, last year we engaged 40,000 volunteers here in the U.S. in those types of outreaches, had over 100 different outreaches that we were a part of and helping develop as well. So I'd say volunteers are really the backbone of what Convoy of Hope is all about. We multiply who we are as an organization many times over because of the volunteers that help us in what we do.
Great, thank you. Many students and social service professionals, even church and community leaders might be listening to this event. And so many of us have an innate desire to serve, whether that be volunteer, travel, missions work, and/or disaster relief. And I know one important aspect of serving well is the ability to build long-standing relationship with communities. Convoy of Hope has several global sites. Can you describe, maybe Mr. Burr, how you would initially engage communities internationally? And then Dr. Pulis, maybe you could talk about how you engage, what the process is for engaging those communities here in the United States. If you'd like to start, Mr. Burr.
Yeah, for us, again, our primary partner is the Kenya Assemblies of God Church, and they help us determine which communities are places of great need and places where we have an opportunity to make an impact. You know, we have limited resources, and so we have to be careful how we use those, and we want to make sure that we're connecting our efforts to something that's going to be there long after we're gone. We don't want to come in and create a problem in the community. Just our presence alone can create all kinds of expectations. And so we have to be careful that we're doing this alongside a local partner that helps us define if it's a real need or if it's, unfortunately, there's a lot of organizations, like in Kenya, for example, local organizations where they run what they call briefcase ministries, where somebody will approach you and say, we have an orphanage or whatever. And you find out later that it's really just kind of a front for somebody to make some money on the side. And so that local entity, that church, helps us identify what's legit and what's not. And the church is always going to be there in the community. They're a great place for us to engage with the community. The pastor usually knows the people personally, knows who is really in need and who is not. And so for us, it's identifying the way we identify a community or a potential program center is a place where we have a church that has a relationship with the community. I've been in Africa my whole life. My parents went when I was 2 years old. They were missionaries in Liberia and Congo. And even as many years as I've spent on the continent of Africa, I still miss it. I still don't get it. I'll miss a sign that was very clear to me. So it's important that I put myself with somebody who's going to be there, who's been there, and who's going to be there long after I'm gone. And that's how we, in the international role, identify communities in need. It can appear to me that they're in need, But when I talk to the people on the ground, they can tell me legitimately who to work with and who not to work with. You can make a lot of mistakes if you work with the wrong person. So for us, it's identifying a place where we have a trusted connection to the community. Otherwise, we're always seen as outsiders. When we come in, it raises expectations the moment that we show up. And so it's important that we have somebody on the ground that can help us navigate that.
The church that you allude to, was that started by Indigenous leaders there in the community, or was it a partnership between your mission organization and this particular community? How was that established?
Yeah, so my role in Kenya is twofold. I'm actually the director of Convoy of Hope Kenya, but I'm also an Assemblies of God missionary.
Mm-hmm.
So my role is to help empower the church and the local community. And the way we do that is through our program centers, our community development programs, our women's empowerment. All of it's done at the local church, physically at the church, sometimes in other locations, but the church is always connected to it. Because we found that in Africa anyway, that the church can really serve as an agent of change. And so when there's community needs, or when there's any kind of issues in the community that need addressing, we can count on the leadership in the church. The leadership in the church is usually seen as a leader in the community as well.
Mm-hmm.
Pastors are often called on to settle disputes between families, or even the local government will call upon church leaders. They're very well respected in the community, and so that gives us an in to the community. I will come and go as a Mzungu, they say in Kenya, as a white person coming and going. That's the term they use for us, and I will always be coming and going. No matter if I live in the community for 20 years, I'll be seen as a Mzungu.
Mm-hmm.
But that local pastor will always be there. And so it's important for us to anchor ourselves to something that's been there and is going to be there after we're gone.
That's great. Dr. Pulis, can you talk a little bit about that initiative in the United States and what that looks like?
Sure. It's really interesting hearing Brian talk about the principles used in Africa, Kenya, and how we contextualize them and try to do the same thing here in the U.S. I think about Marquette Park in South Chicago, where for the last few years, when we first went in, you had a lot of gun violence going on in Chicago, making national news. And so we actually were contacted by the churches in that area saying, we really feel like we want to go in and do something in Chicago. Now, what was interesting was we were contacted by churches that were in the suburbs. So culturally, you've got a big divide and a big difference there. Oftentimes in a lot of our major cities where we're working, we may have more Caucasian or white churches in the suburbs who feel like, hey, we want to do something to help reach a more urban population within a city. And so you've got the distinctions that are there of outsiders, so to speak, wanting to help insiders that are in the community, and bridging that gap basically is part of what we do. And I would describe that as we always want to build a table of collaboration or partnership. How do we find the good things that are already happening in all of our cities, pull as many of those entities together and help them do a little bit more? And that's really all a Convoy of Hope is. We're a catalyst. My high school chemistry teacher described a catalyst as something that enters into a chemical reaction. It either starts the reaction or it speeds it up. And that's really our job. We're either starting something that may be some networking that might be new, or more likely, we're helping speed up the good things that are already there. So it's through the local community, identifying those partners that can help us the most. So we have a couple different ways in which we connect. As I mentioned in Chicago, we had a church contact us. So our first couple of questions are, what are you already doing when it comes to compassion ministry or outreach or volunteering or those types of things to reach the community? And then two, what kind of network do you already have in place? And if they're not doing any of that, then we'll coach them. Hey, why don't you do some things on a smaller scale? And as you build up, let's stay in touch. When you get to the point where we can really help and serve you the best, we'd be glad to come in. But in Chicago, for instance, they were already friends, had relationship with pastors and business entities that were in the part of the city they wanted to reach. So as we began to talk and meet, it did become what now is a wide table of partnership. The aldermen or the park sets comes in and helps us in so many ways. We have a major construction company, John Burns Construction Company, that comes in and helps us with all of our logistics. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois comes in and helps us with our medical area. Southwest Development Corporation, which is long-term doing development in that neighborhood, brings all the different service agencies that are there to help to bring that part in. And then our churches also come alongside and provide a lot of our volunteers. So you pull that type of a table together, all of a sudden you've got the best of the best. Recently, being back in Chicago, met with Tina James, who works for the Southwest Development Corporation. She said, Steve, you don't understand. She goes, Convoy of Hope now is the talk of the development community. Explain that. What she meant was you bring outside resources, but you partner with local organizations and entities that are here long-term continuing to help people. So some of the resources we bring, partnering with the long-term boots on the ground, people that are there. I'm not an expert on Chicago. I don't know, as Brian talked about, in Kenya, who are the legitimate organizations to work with, who are the people that are really, truly doing good. But this table of partnership can identify and invite the right groups in. So to summarize, we will come into a community in a number of different ways and engage in a number of different ways. One is sometimes we get a phone call from a local entity, hey, we'd like to talk about a community event. Other times, it's actually us saying, hey, here's an area we would like to go to, like South Central LA a couple years back. We had some partners in Watts in that area who we'd done some things with in the past. And so we said, hey, what can we do to come in? What could this look like? And so pulling the Watts Gang Task Force to the table and going to their meetings and asking them and getting their input on the right way to handle it, the right thing to do. There's a number of ways in which it can happen, and had a phenomenal opportunity to pull a number of different entities in Watts together. One more example, had a group of businessmen in Cleveland who had partnered with Convoy of Hope to help us in other ways hear about our event in Chicago I was mentioning earlier. So they came in and saw it. And when they saw the impact of so many different guests and volunteers and what was happening, said, we got to bring this to Cleveland. And so the business community pulled together their network and actually started with the businesses, many of whom were involved in their local churches, who then pulled their churches on board, who then pulled all the other pieces to this collaboration or partnership table. And that was the on-ramp to get things going. And we're in South Cleveland last year. This fall, plan to be in East Cleveland and continue a multi-year process in Cleveland, including now Akron and some of the neighboring areas. So there's a number of ways in which we can engage. But I think to Brian's point earlier, making sure that we look to local leadership who are really the experts. In the same way, I'm always an outsider, and I say that up front. I will never know the cities that we're working in. So looking to those leaders, pulling that table together to say, you steer us, you guide us. The final thing I'd throw in here, just on the contextualization principle, our community events always look different. We utilize local team leaders who make that area look the way they know it needs to look. After 26 years and 1,200 plus community events all across the United States, Convoy of Hope's learned a lot of good ways not to do a community event. So we try to share some of that, but really Chicago, because it's local leaders that are putting each of our areas of service together, is going to look different than Cleveland. It's going to look different than what Akron will look like. It's going to look different than what Watts looked like, or Orlando or Philadelphia last year when we were there. I say we've got a pretty good starting point. We've got a structure. It's really just the skeleton, though. So local team leaders, they put the muscle, they put the flesh, they put the smell, they put the style. They make it look like their city, which is really one of the keys to our being effective.
And I think you hit on so many critical issues, just to reiterate too, that even have to do with, viewing communities in a macro sense. If we look specifically to macro social work, this is macro practice, and that's sitting down at the table with communities in need and listening to what they have to educate us about. And then, providing these services and rising up or utilizing Indigenous leadership. And I think those are really critical points. So thank you for that. The next question has several components to it. Let me begin by stating that most large nonprofits have a vast volunteer base. Can you explain how you best utilize your volunteer base, both nationally and internationally? And just a first follow-up on that is is there specific training volunteers go through to perhaps provide cultural competency, engage communities effectively, promote sustainability? What would that look like if someone were interested in volunteering with one of your community events or in, Kenya per se? Could you speak to that?
Go ahead,
Sure.
Brian.
Yeah, for us, we have local volunteers that we engage on a consistent basis. A lot of young people in Kenya are looking for attachments, they call it, like internships. And so we have them come out and help us in communities where we're doing women's empowerment training, the women's business training. You can imagine there's a language barrier. And so we have a lot of our volunteers will help some of the women go through the curriculum as they're going through the training. They help them with the reading and the writing because, as I mentioned, many of the women have no educational background at all. Some of them have never been to school. And so we've had over 500 women go through this business training program. And so a lot of it has been with the help of volunteers. They also will help us document a lot of our weights and measurements when we check to see the nutritional values that are in our program centers. They'll go out and do those measurements for us. At one point, we had calculated for our small team. We have a staff of 5, including myself, and I'm in the States right now, so they're even more shorthanded. To travel to all of our program centers and come back to Nairobi would take 2 months, and we only have 16 program centers. So you can imagine just traveling within one country, it takes several days to get places. So by mobilizing volunteers, we can expand what we do, we can multiply what we accomplish. And so, and again, they understand the context a lot better than I would, for example, even though I've been in Kenya since 1997. But the way that we use our volunteers that come in with our teams from the States, we have a number of field teams that will come with Convoy of Hope. And those would be young people or perhaps churches that are already engaged with Convoy of Hope. They'll come out and help us maybe build a greenhouse or maybe do something in a community that we're already engaged in. And so they come out for a specific reason, a specific role. And I think for us, it's a short window. It's usually a week that they're there. They might have 4 or 5 days on the ground in the community, where we try to get them as much exposure to the community as possible, with the understanding that they're there for a specific task. They're not going to save the community or change the community in that short period of time. They're there to assist and to try to empower something that's already on the ground and ongoing, that again will be there long after they're back home and even long after I'm gone. Mm-hmm. So, but they serve a specific purpose for that short time that they're there. Sometimes they're engaging with small kids programs while maybe a construction project's going on, while the adults are involved in something else. It could be something like painting or upgrades to a facility, or maybe even participating in the construction of a water harvesting project where we put gutters on a building to collect water for a school or something like that. So we usually engage our teams from the States in a short-term project that produces long-term results, like, as I mentioned, a water harvesting project or an agriculture project that's going to continue to produce results. Mm. So some kind of infrastructure is usually where we plug them in.
That's great.
Yeah, just to kind of agree with what Brian's saying, he talks about our field teams that come in, the cultural competencies that go on during their training is pretty amazing. Sometimes short-term missions trips have gotten a bad rap when it comes to relief or development. Partnering with local entities, with indigenous leadership, with indigenous principles, with sustainable efforts that will continue well beyond, that come in and help, like Brian just described, are actually a pretty vital way in which, again, outside resources partnering with long-term initiatives can help become very sustainable. And so those teams, Matt Wilkie, our field teams director, boy, does a phenomenal job of explaining the difference between just your own personal experience, not coming back talking about your story so much as coming back talking about the story of the people that are there and understanding where they're at and what they're doing. So what Brian just described is a strong way in which we utilize volunteers. Here in the U.S., there are a number of ways in which we do that locally at our World Distribution Center, which I've got that up as my virtual background behind me. We have on most Tuesday nights, of course, it's not functioning right now with COVID-19 and won't for a while, but we have between 200 and 300 volunteers locally that come in. Oftentimes it's fraternities or sororities from the local university. It's businesses that bring in, let's help our give back to the community, or it's churches that come in, and they will do all types of, from packaging food that's going to go internationally to pre-bagging groceries for areas like Watts, where I was talking about before, or Detroit or Flint, where we've done outreaches and need our groceries pre-bagged, and just a number of things that need done. Our truck drivers, you see a couple of trucks behind us. We have almost 20 trucks in our fleet here in the U.S. We only have 2 full-time drivers on our entire team. Everything else is volunteer-based. So people who have the credentials, who have driven, some are retired, some are early retirement, but still are active and able to drive the trucks for us, crisscrossing the nation. And right now, we talk later about some of what we're doing with COVID-19. It's those volunteer drivers that are sending out our trucks with all our supplies in it all across the United States. They just this year, in the last month or two, received the award from the state for the safe driving team and won a statewide reward. And the head of our trucking was actually put on the state board for that panel. So those are some ways in which we engage volunteers. Specifically in community events, we have to have volunteers. And I'll say this, it's pretty easy for the day of to get people to come out that want to engage and help their community and give back. So we'll have anywhere from a few hundred to where I've had 3,300 volunteers in an event in Indianapolis where we had over 10,000 guests show up. So to have 1,500 to 2,000 volunteers on the day of the event is pretty typical for a lot of what we're doing. Part of that is we want to be a catalyst for more, and we could talk about that a little bit more later. But after that, when people have engaged the first time, it's okay, what's next? What do we do? And so all the agencies that we've partnered with, the community organizations, the churches, others, having that next step, hey, we did this together. Now here's a multitude, a variety of avenues in which you can continue to volunteer is a key. But a couple of specific examples. I've mentioned Chicago a little bit. Natalie Sabos, who's one of our team leaders up in Chicago, got involved through our community event, became more involved in what Convoy of Hope has done, and has now opened up basically a Chicago hub for disaster services. They have their own storage area that they've acquired. They have supplies that are coming in. They're one of our distribution points for what we're doing with COVID right now, a truckload of supplies going up to help them. All volunteers out of that team that started out of our community event. When we come in for a specific community event, I talked about that mix of suburban and urban leaders that oftentimes comes together, getting them around the table together, starting the dialogue. One of our cities, the first time we came in, we were meeting with some urban pastors, and the suburban pastors just kind of brought it up. Hey, what do you guys think, us wanting to partner with you? Understanding there's, could be a little bit of a tension or communication battles there. And one of the urban pastors said, well, frankly, until now, we didn't even know you cared. To be blunt, he used a little bit stronger language than that. But for our viewing audience, I'll paraphrase it into that. But it was really, the urban pastors felt it was kind of the first time they'd had some interest from those, out in the suburbs around them. Since then, that partnership has grown, and it does take time. It's not just a one-time show up and do something, but it's the fact that the churches continue to partner back, continue to help long-term, continue to share. So one of the ways in which we do that, we do have levels of training that our volunteers go through. So as a local team, that partnership table recruits volunteers that are multifaceted, do have a diverse background. Some are urban, some are not. Some are different ethnicities, some represent different quantities or different parts of the city. As they come together, our team does come in, and we do we do team leader trainings for every single team leader, where there's 3 or 4 people in the room, and we're walking through some of the things that we're talking about here. Following that group of leaders that starts at about 30 but can grow with the assistant team leaders, they meet regularly leading up to the community event. The closer we get, the more often that they they meet together. So there's communication going on. There's the opportunity to talk through some of the issues that might be culturally different. In the suburbs, we promote things a certain way. You're in an urban context, you promote things a different way. So some of those communication styles and some of the other issues that naturally come up, there's the opportunity to build trust, build relationship. Our team is always available. We have regular coaching calls with the leadership in each of those cities just to kind of walk through, coach, and help. Ultimately, though, we're looking at those leaders locally. I always say, give us your best. We'll send them back better. And we've had more than one community who have said, once we've gone through the process that Convoy of Hope uses with our volunteers, we're implementing some of the structure into our own local systems, whether that's business, whether that's church, whether that's community organization, the need to communicate, the need to build trust, the need to talk through a myriad of issues that vary to location. So it's critical. And as much as we try to do it, there's always new challenges. And every year we're tweaking our model and learning new ways to become a little bit better at it.
That's fantastic. Yeah, my second follow-up question was, in what capacity has this been beneficial to your communities? And I think you did touch upon some of that. The next follow-up question is a bit more difficult, but I think, you know, an important issue to raise, and that's maybe if you could give us some examples of how volunteering can sometimes hinder or hurt communities you serve. You know, what is the reality of that in your respective communities, and you know, how can we just be aware of some of those red flags, some of those ways that you know, we don't approach communities in a way that they should be approached. Mr. Burr, if you want to start with that, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's important that you don't go in with an attitude like you are going to save the community. As I've mentioned several times, I'm always going to come and go. I'm not going to be there long term the way the community is. It's important that there's ownership in the community. In his book, Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky said, never do for someone what they can do for themselves. I think that's a really important lesson to learn, is that we can often come in with an attitude that we think we have something to offer without consulting the community. First of all, do they really want this? Is it something that they can manage themselves? Is it something that they're already doing? You know, Steve mentioned the going in and finding out what's already happening in the community and building on that. That's really important, that you don't come in offering something that the community doesn't need or doesn't even want. Okay, confession time. I actually helped a group of young people that were already in Kenya. They were working with a summer camp, and they were, you know, they had like 6 weeks of summer camps set up. And so in between 2 sessions, the director of the camp said, I'm looking for a place to engage these 35 university students from the States. I want them out in a community where they can get a feel for what it's like. And is there something that I can have them do? Well, I had been talking to a leader in the community about, it's a Maasai community, which is totally dependent on cattle. And they face drought after drought after drought. And so I thought, well, this would be a great time to introduce them to agriculture. Maybe we can build a greenhouse, and that will help them understand the value of maybe growing their own stuff rather than depending on trading sheep or goats or cows for vegetables and things like that. And so we had this short window of time to get these kids out in the community, build this greenhouse. They raised the money for it, and we went out and we did it. They never grew a single thing in the greenhouse. What happened was we didn't do our proper homework on the front end. We didn't do the proper training on the front end. And so the first problem was we helped them plant tomatoes, which is a crop that should have grown very well in that area. They had a water source. I thought I had checked all the boxes. It looked on paper and in my mind like it would have been a great success. But farming is completely foreign to the Maasai people. More and more, there's some communities that are adapting to it, but at that time, in this particular community, it was completely foreign. A limb fell out of a tree and poked a hole in the roof of the greenhouse. And the pastor who was of the church where we had done the greenhouse called me and said, there's a hole in the roof. Can you come out and fix it? And I said, no. I said, just put a piece of tape over it, just cover the hole. And he said, no, I need you to send a technician, somebody to come out and fix it. Well, we're 3 hours from that village, from Nairobi. So by the time somebody went out to have a look at it, red spider mites had invaded the crop and destroyed the entire crop within 3 days. So they never actually grew a thing. And so he was kind of demoralized by what had happened. And, it just stood there until the plastic had rotted from the sun. And so I learned from that you're better off not doing something and working with what's already happening on the ground than introducing something that is completely foreign to the community. I hate to say, but it was kind of a waste of resources, but it was a huge learning experience for me because I had gotten ahead of myself and I didn't allow them to own the project from the very beginning. They may have chosen to do a greenhouse at some point, but the timing of that project would have been theirs, not mine. And so that was a huge mistake that I made, and I learned from that. We've had some very successful greenhouses since that, but I learned from that not to rush into something just because it looked like a great idea to me. The community has to see it as a great idea. And so in some ways, I feel like I set them up for failure, and that was my own fault. And I learned from that to allow the community to move at their own pace, not because I have some kind of a deadline. I only have this much time to get this done. We got to move. We're Americans. We stand in front of the microwave and go, what's taking so long? But in Africa, things move at a different pace. A friend of mine from Ghana told me one time, he said, you Americans have beautiful watches, but here in Africa, we have time. And so it's an important thing to remember that everything moves at a different pace. And if you rush it, you'll miss the greatness of it. In Kenya, they have a saying, it's haraka, haraka, haina baraka. It means if you hurry and you rush, you miss the blessing. And so since that time, I found that when I take my time and I work in the community at their pace, then things work out where there's ownership, there's involvement from the people in the community, and they're proud of it. They own it when it's over, and they don't call me to come and fix it. They fix it themselves. So I think it's really important to go at their pace. At least internationally, that's what I've discovered.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful example. Brian, that's a beautiful example you just gave. Thank you for that. Dr. Pulis, any examples that you can give us?
Yeah, I think just getting right down to it on a community event level, as we've all said, I'll echo what we've been talking about. Convoy of Hope's not the answer to poverty. So coming into a community event thinking that we are, thinking that what we're going to do, the way that we can hinder sometimes volunteering is if the community only holds an event. If it's a one-day approach, we're going to come in on this one day and make a difference. We kind of straddle the line between what I would define as relief and development, meaning as I look at more a community event as being in the relief bucket, let's say, of relief, rehabilitation, and development. We are providing short-term goods. When we ask our guests when they leave, what's the number one thing that helps you the most? Groceries is always number one on that list. And we find the groceries and the haircuts and the back to school time, the shoes and those things truly help people who are working poor, that are struggling to make the budget hit the end of the month and don't have the funds to get people back to school, kids, those types of things. So it is relief where we're trying to help with development. And in the U.S. in our community events, we're not a development organization. We're partnering with development organizations. So that's where we're a catalyst. We want to help the long-term organizations that are in the neighborhoods like Chicago and the other places we've mentioned earlier. We want to resource them, what they're already doing. So we want to connect people to those services. And I'll just briefly mention, we typically at our community events, we'll have a community services area. We'll have a health services with dental, medical, as well as potentially even optometry that's there available to help. We have job and career services where we can actually have a job fair that's there, as well as teach skills for interviewing and keeping a job. Veteran service area, a nutrition area. One of our national sponsors, National Breast Cancer Foundation, is there for all the ladies that are there, and our churches that offer ongoing help. So I think a hindrance sometimes is if we just look at the day of the event and we don't put as much of a focus on the long-term follow-up. Every one of those service areas, people may come for the free goods, but when mom's there with their 2 or 3 little kids and they walk in and they see a new opportunity for a new job, or all of a sudden in front of them are all the social agencies in our community services area that they can connect and enroll in on that day. If we don't focus on the follow-up, if we haven't encouraged and trained those local team leaders, those organizations that have come and partners in those service areas to truly track people long-term, then it does just become a day. And although there's benefit to the day, our real goal is connect them to that long-term service piece. So just holding an event, not doing the follow-up in a very practical sense, I think volunteers can go home patting themselves on the back saying, wow, look what we did. And sure, there's some positives that come out of that, but when it comes to development and long-term, that's what we really want to encourage and be a part of. So there's a tension point. We all have shiny object syndrome. Here comes the latest shiny object. Let's focus on that. Let's jump in on it. And the event has a lot of energy around it, but it really is only a catalyst for the process. There's a process before for leadership and volunteer training. There's a process during of connecting and growing those relationships, but it's really that process afterward of follow-up that has to happen for us to really be effective and successful.
That's good. That's great information for our listeners to hear. I think my fourth follow-up was, what would you consider best practice for aiding communities? And I think that you hit on some of that, but it also really correlates to my next question. And, basically in many cases, volunteers work in developing countries with organizations that really conduct activities such as some of the things you've alluded to already: health promotion, education, environmental conservation. What are some practical ways that we can help communities become more sustainable? I know that Dr. Pulis, you talk about your community events, and I know Mr. Burr, you've discussed just some of the projects that some of the teams come in and help your communities with. I'm just thinking of things that help these communities grow economically. And I think when I hear Mr. Burr, you talk about the micro enterprises for women, the women empowerment programs. I think those are critical programs for the communities. You identified the need, and you provide resources to help educate these women be successful leaders in their community. Maybe share your favorite, in saying all of that, maybe share your favorite success stories so far, 1 or 2 of them, in terms of, man, that was something we really did well. And, we have this ongoing relationship now with this community that's producing, lots of positive things for the younger generation, so on and so forth. Can you speak to some of those success stories?
I think probably, as you mentioned, the women's empowerment has had probably the largest impact, because we've seen women, particularly in the Maasai communities, go from a place of powerlessness to a place of having a voice and being respected in the community. I was writing a paper for a class I was taking, and I did a survey of 100 women who had been in our program. Okay, 90 women were actually in our program. 10% was the control group. I wanted to see how the women in our program compared to women who were in the same community but were not eligible to be in our program for different reasons. Maybe they were related to someone who was running the program, or maybe they were too well off compared to we were really looking for the poorest people in the community. And what we found is that there was a spillover effect, that even the 10% of the women that we surveyed experienced the same kinds of benefits as the women that were in the program, because for example, all of the women, 100% of them said they were more involved in their local churches now because they saw the benefit of the church in the community. They saw the church as an agent of change. They saw the church as a place where people could come for resources, not just Sunday morning meetings, but they could come there for training. They could come there for English classes and things like that. They saw the church differently as a result of that program. All of the women in the program said in the survey said that they recognized the value of different food groups in their daily meals. They had been traditionally, they would depend on certain things in their diet, but because of this training, they were seeing better nutrition in their families' daily meals. They were adding vegetables that they previously hadn't, and that was all part of our training. Some of the women had actually chosen agriculture as their business, which was unheard of, especially for Maasai people. So there's been a lot of really positive things that have happened. All of the pastors and their wives who conduct, so the women are grouped into small groups once they're in the program, and they meet every week at that local church to discuss their failures and their successes. And the pastor or his wife, either one, will be involved in those meetings. They contribute to a collective savings. And so 3 women in the group have a key to the box. So no one can open the box by themselves. There has to be 3 people present. And they monitor each other, they mentor each other. And then after a certain time period, like we monitor their progress for 6 months to make sure that they develop good habits. After 6 months, they're eligible to borrow from that collective savings. And then they monitor the loans. So they're contributing to this pool of money. And then they're also able to borrow to expand their business or whatever. And so 100% of the women that we surveyed said that they now have a savings. They've never had a savings before. They'd never really held money before. The man controls all that in their society. And one of the women, I was shocked, one of the women had $500 in savings, which is an enormous amount of money in their culture, especially for a woman to have that kind of a savings. They all said that they spent their money from their business on education for their children, medicine for their children, and different varieties of food. So the positives to that were just huge. I think probably of everything that we're doing, that probably had the greatest impact. Our Children's Feeding Initiative is also something that has had a big impact. We have found that a lot of kids are staying in school longer. We find that at lunchtime, they would typically go out to look for something to eat, and many of them wouldn't come back to school. So they'd miss the whole second half of the day. So then when it comes time for the comprehensive test at the end of the semester or the trimester, they were doing poorly. So they weren't advancing. They weren't getting a chance to go to high school if they made it through middle school. Now we're finding many of the kids are where we have program centers, their test scores have improved. They're beating a lot of the other government schools with their test scores, which means they're eligible to go on to national high schools. So a lot of the kids in our program are finding out that they're the first person in their family to ever go to high school. Some of them even go on to college. So it's really exciting to see that just providing nutrition at lunchtime is keeping kids in school longer. We're finding that their health is better. So a lot of things like that are byproducts of what we're doing. And it's exciting to see that, to be a part of something like that is really changing lives.
Great examples.
Yeah, I've mentioned pieces of this story, but I think Chicago is a great example. And to kind of tie it all together, again, we were approached by churches who said, hey, we'd like to come in and do something in the city. And so that first year of putting this partnership together, now to look back about 5 years, to be at the point we're at, we've moved that community event where it's only every other year. So typically in the even years. So in the odd years, they're continuing year round. And to see what's come out of that table of partnership, of collaboration, which Convoy of Hope doesn't have anything to do with. We're not resourcing that. We're not leading that. We didn't even suggest it. It's just entities working together. The construction company we work with went back into the park, and they actually paved a road with the approval of the city that had so many potholes in it. It was difficult to use at all. One of the businesses that got involved saw the elementary school just diagonal from the park. And one of the years right before Christmas time said, hey, these kids need coats, and did a coat drive, and were able to come in, distribute that through the school. To see Southwest Development Corporation and Tina James that I mentioned before, partnering with all the organizations that are there and continue year-round assistance and help. Actually had some of the churches that are more in the suburbs come down in and start volunteering at some of the after-school programs and other things that some of our urban churches were doing. some of the resources that helped some of the buildings that were dilapidating go in and do some construction projects on it and help that. We've mentioned the disaster services team that formed out of this. It was really just getting up and going in the last year, and now boom, we've got COVID-19 and we're able to distribute through them, all that locally, all that set up, ready to go, on and on and on, the outreaches and the continued long-term help that are happening there. That's one great example. A lot of our cities, I put it down to that catalyst of the table of partnership. Once we start sharing best practices, once they start saying, hey, I'm in this area, well, I'm in this area, well, how do you do this? Well, how do you do this? Let's work better together. I think I'd summarize it this way. When I think about some ethical aspects, the approaches that we're looking at, how do we become sustainable, those long-term type questions, I come back to ABCD, asset-based community development. And when you look at resources like When Helping Hurts, Corbett and Fickert, or my personal favorite, I like Walking with the Poor. I mean, I like them all, but I think Bryant Myers and Walking with the Poor for me is probably the one that I go back to the most, although most of these major authors are saying very similar things, putting it into their context and putting their approach, and each bring their own strengths to it. But those are two resources that I would recommend. When you look at asset-based community development, ABCD for short, the wrong starting point is what's wrong with you. So there's a needs-based development. That's the wrong starting point. It's basically, how can I fix you? It doesn't raise dignity. It can focus on me coming in as the savior. I've got a title, I've got resources, let me come in and fix all your problems, which, as we've been talking about, is not the right approach. It focuses on what's lacking in a community, what's lacking in a person. In contrast, the right way to do that, the ABCD model, involves those you're helping. So you're asking the question, what's right with you? So you begin with the assets, not the needs. And Brian's talked about that in Kenya with the Maasai people, illustrated that so well. You're asking questions like, what needs can you identify that must be addressed, but what gifts are already available that you can use to improve your life, that of your neighborhood? This affirms dignity. What do you already have? What are the strengths? What are the resources? How can you move out of that? How can you steward your own gifts and resources? How can individuals, how can organizations in the community work together to improve your community? The downside of that is, walking with the poor, other way, it's messier, it's dirty, it's not as clean. You don't walk out after a day patting yourself on the back going, wow, look at all we did. You take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back and then another step forward, and it's long term, and it's all of those things. And that's why so many people start and then sometimes don't see it all the way through, because it's a lot more frustrating. The problems you realize of poverty are multifaceted, the systemic issues that are there, so many things. Yet that's truly the only way to look at sustainable, to look at long term, is to take that type of ABCD approach.
Those are great resources for our audience, good models that you're highlighting there. I just appreciate that information. Dr. Pulis, you did allude to COVID-19, and that's a good segue into my next question. It's in light of COVID-19, this pandemic that we're in. We know that volunteer efforts, you've already alluded to this in terms of Convoy of Hope, are well underway across the world. Can you describe the response that you are providing? And maybe Dr. Pulis, we can begin with you, since those initiatives are already beginning. And then Mr. Burr, we could maybe move on to, what you've been hearing in terms of, what's the greatest need in Kenya? What are people experiencing there, and what are you working towards in terms of response to that? I think the aftermath of this is something nobody can anticipate, and just so would be good for our listeners to hear, about some models that are working well in our communities, how we can be praying and navigating and maybe gathering teams together to effectively work in these communities.
Sure, it's overwhelming right now. It unfortunately isn't going to get better. We look at the economic news, knowing that we're talking the very early part of April, and in the last 2 weeks, There's been approximately 10 million new applicants to the unemployment list through all of our states. The modern record before that was 177,000 in a week. And so now we've had 3.3 million and 6.6 million. I can't fathom the scale, how much that has multiplied. And that's right now. We look back to 2008, 2009, it took a while for the economic effects to hit local communities. You saw it on Wall Street, but to get to Main Street, there was a time difference and you could kind of track it. Boom, this has hit in a short period of time and it's hit Main Street. Heard 50% of all small businesses could close in 90 days. 25% could be closed in 30 days. So that type of projection, and some of that's hypothetical, obviously, but the need is tremendous. It's overwhelming. I think some of the areas that are hit the hardest, I said in Greene County in Missouri, and our zone 1 of our area has a 25% poverty rate. The domestic violence is double our state average. So all of a sudden you've got kids can't go to school, and so they're already at home where there's already pre-existing unhealthy situations, violent tendencies and behavior. That just escalates. And so many of those kids are dependent on school for food. Our school system provides breakfast, provides lunch, and sometimes even a dinner. So some of our schools have found ways to have drive-by food service that can be picked up. And I'll talk about more of those things in a moment. But right now, just illustrating the need that we're all aware of. And that's today. What's that look like 30 days from now? What's that look like 60 days from now? When our unemployment tops and hits a high point, and then it's going to take months and years to re-engage and have those families re-employed. The need. So the need for meals, the need for food is right in front of us. We have just launched and started a campaign to provide 10 million meals to those in need because of COVID-19. We've had hundreds of requests. The last I heard from 37 states, and that was 2 days ago. It's probably gone up since then. What Convoy of Hope's able to do, because of our long-term partnership, we're actually still able to buy groceries and supplies at under wholesale from our partners. Oftentimes we get things in times of disaster, in times of response, in times of need. We'll get them donated from major manufacturers. Well, as we know, the supply chain's been taxed. If you try to go online and buy groceries or have stuff sent to you, you got to get up early in the morning to make it happen. And I think that's going to level out at some point and hopefully get back to where the supplies are there, but it's made it difficult for us as well. Because of those partnerships, again, able to buy it below wholesale prices, we're sending out trucks across the United States to key areas. We had an outreach schedule for Sonoma County in Washington, Everett, Washington, just north of Seattle, right there in the greater Seattle area, which was, of course, the first epicenter. Now that epicenter has moved to New York and other hot areas, but we've shifted that to more of a point of distribution of supplies that can be there. So we're looking at it as we're not sending people on the ground. We're sure not pulling together hundreds of volunteers or even dozens of volunteers. There's no way. The health of everybody involved, our volunteers, our guests that would come is our number one safety aspect. So what we're shifting to is how do we become the supply to those already existing networks and feeding opportunities that are there, whether that's a food bank that already has a drive-through model set up that's using the right safety protocols, whether that is some of the schools. We've got a network of partnerships all across the U.S. So that's what we're evaluating. What's the best use as people donate to us, as we're able to multiply their donation by buying it below wholesale, we can get more bang for the buck, so to speak. We can multiply their money out and get that right into the hands of those in need by working through existing distribution methods, which frankly has always been our model around the U.S. We're not one to put up brick and mortar and put a lot of money into infrastructure. We more want to work through existing partnerships to help do that. So it's a flexible model. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So every community perhaps could be doing it a little bit different. Schools, communities, churches, and others. Probably an easy way to think of it is we're supplying the food pantries and the other things that are already available to be able to pick up food and do that. And just recently, just 2 weeks, one of our partners who long-term been working with them for a few years, was able to say the fire chief, the police chief, the school superintendent have all started working with them because we were able to get a truckload of supplies in our long-term relationship there to truly help. And the final thing I would say, we're doing all of this while we're maintaining all of our international commitments. So we currently feed 300,000 kids regularly around the world in our program countries. No funding is being diverted from that. We're taking new funding that's coming in and donations that are coming in to truly address the needs that are here, primarily in a safe way, so no one's health is put in jeopardy, but to truly get food and supplies to people most in need.
I think, Dr. Pulis, you hit on something critical, and that's nobody could have anticipated what the pandemic would look like, and it has shifted the way that you are serving communities, but you are able to do that well because of existing relationships, and that is a key takeaway for me from this particular program. So great points there. Mr. Burr, can you speak to Kenya and how the pandemic has affected Kenya specifically?
Sure, and just to kind of tack on to what Dr. Pulis was saying about existing relationships being really important. Back in 2007, 2008, we had just opened our office in Kenya, and the post-election violence happened, and there was tribal warfare, people killing each other. And I went to a meeting where the Council of Churches of Kenya met, and so every church organization, all the denominations were represented. The Red Cross was there, everybody was there. And they all did a report on how many of their churches had been damaged. And the Kenya Sons of God, they all agreed, was the most hard hit of all the churches in the area, in the country. And they said, the reason is because you guys are everywhere. They said, it doesn't matter where you go in Kenya, you'll find a Kenya Sons of God church. And so that has provided us with a network of distribution points. Churches become warehouses, remote warehouses for us. And so anytime there's a disaster in one part of the country, whether it's drought, whether it's flash floods, whether it's some kind of violence or something like that, we have a church that we can count on to be our hands and feet on the ground. They mobilize their members to serve as volunteers. And so typically what we do is we deliver to that location. If it's food that we send out with our truck, we have a delivery truck, a four-wheel drive, military type truck that goes places many of the other guys can't get to. It looks like a huge Tonka truck, but our driver Wilson comes back from delivery saying, it was amazing. He said, I was just going, it was muddy and I was going and everybody was parked on the side of the road waiting for the road to dry, but I just kept going. So the convoy of hope was there. But so we use those as remote warehouses for us and distribution points. Then we also have a system where we're able to mobilize money, because in some cases, like in this situation, maybe you don't want to draw a large crowd. Maybe you don't want to put your driver in harm's way. We can mobilize money through our mobile money system. So we have M-Pesa, which is a local mobile money system. I think something like 75% of Kenya's GDP goes through M-Pesa at some point. It's crazy how people use it like their own bank. And so in one disaster response, we mobilized over $50,000. The first $50,000 we sent to some of these remote distribution areas to buy food, we never started our truck. We sent it all through local mobile money accounts. And then the pastors just report through WhatsApp. They send pictures of their receipts or whatever it is. So we're able to mobilize quite quickly without ever even leaving our warehouse if it's just a matter of purchasing food in remote places. In a lot of these places, food is available. It's just their purchasing power has been cut off. You have a lot of people who live hand to mouth. If they don't work today, they don't eat today. Nairobi, for example, about half the population lives in 2 major slums, and they literally are there working daily for what they eat daily. And so the church right now is trying to come up with a plan. How do we respond to that? And so we are kind of putting a plan together with them to see how we can respond. But already we've mobilized over 200,000 meals that are going out in our truck to locations that we know are hard hit, where we have that remote distribution point in place, and we can partner with people that are already on the ground.
Good information. I alluded to this the other day, but when we were chatting, but just listening to stories about, coming out of Africa and India and what that looks like for those cultures specifically. And you did allude to that, people, it's hand to mouth, you do your work for the day and that's how you provide for your family. And now you're not able to do your work.
Yeah.
And, what does that look like? And even in the States, I think of, individuals who are homeless and the more economic pressure issues we will have due to this pandemic, what will that look like for people to get the resources that they need, and especially those living in poverty. It's already difficult to have access to healthcare, to have access to food and shelter, and just really important things for us to be thinking and praying about as we move forward. You've provided us with some great resources. Any other resources? A student had a question the other day. This is a bit off the cuff, but she said, if we were interested in wanting to volunteer our time in different capacities, what should we be looking for in terms of, an organization and how they approach communities? Any more information?
There's a great resource, charitynavigator.org is a great resource where you can go to see what organizations are all about, how much of their money goes to overhead, accountability, transparency. And I'm thankful that Convoy of Hope is a great organization, and they rank very well in terms of transparency and accountability, and how much money there goes to overhead, how much of your dollar actually gets to the need. So I'm really proud to have been working with Convoy for well over 20 years now. So, but that's a great resource. That I would point people towards.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I would say it's difficult right now because we can't get out and do something. We all want to do something, but we're all staying at home. So it has shifted the models. It has shifted our approaches to what we're looking at. But to add to what Brian's saying, go with those that you trust, with people that you know, and use some of the principles that we're talking about. Ask yourself the questions. Is who you're looking to partner with? Are you looking for long-term sustainable solutions? Are you looking at what's right in a situation, not what's wrong? Are we empowering local leaders indigenously to make the decisions? Some of those long-term sustainable questions will really help you to know that you're truly helping and working with an organization that is going to make a long-term difference. As Brian mentioned, start with your church. What's your church doing? You talk about churches all over Kenya. What's your church doing that's helpful? And if your church hasn't started using some of these principles or partnering with organizations to do that, this may be a conversation you want to start. One example, we don't need every church having their own individual food bank when a community could come together and have one way in which because everybody who's in need knows, well, on Tuesday I go to this place, on Wednesday night I go to this place, on Friday I go to this place, and you get, not that they don't need the help, that's not what I'm saying, but if we pool our resources together, we can be much more long-term, helping people climb out of poverty instead of just enabling the poverty that they're in. So a number of principles like that you want to look at, especially when you're wanting to serve locally.
Good point. Stepping out of our silos sometimes.
That's a really good point. Don't reinvent the wheel. I had a local pastor ask me about starting a goat project because there was another goat project in the area where somebody had started, kind of like Heifer International does, where they provide a goat to a family and then the offspring comes back to the program. And, they provide a pair of goats to a family. When the offspring comes back to the program, they give that to another family and so forth. And I said, well, there's already one in your area. I'm not going to start another one. No, but we want one that's part of our church. I said, no, we're not going to do that. There's a great program there. It doesn't matter if it's theirs or not. Let's get behind them. So I think that's important too. Like Steve was saying, don't reinvent the wheel. Let's pool our resources. We can go a lot farther.
Absolutely. I just, Dr. Pulis and Brian Burr, I really want to thank you for your time. I know that you are very busy individuals, and Thank you for the good work that you are doing for serving communities well here and abroad, and really for helping us through this program gain some perspective on how to educate and equip and empower individuals who are participating, in volunteer efforts or global servanthood or disaster relief efforts. You've given us some critical insight, some good takeaways here, and it was just a pleasure talking with you. For more information on Convoy of Hope, you can visit their website at www.convoyofhope.org. Dr. Pulis has shared some information about the initiative that is now started due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And at the end of this event, we will have some information on how you can donate to that cause. Thank you again.
Thank you everyone for taking the time to attend our virtual community night. It's been such a blessing to be able to provide this information. As a reminder, for those that are interested in receiving 2 free continuing education units, a link will be provided in the live chat. It'll say Continuing Education Units Evaluation. So just fill that out with your email and license number so we can get your certificate to you. For those students that are being offered extra credit, please follow a link that will also be in the live chat. It'll just say extra credit for students. Just fill out that form and we'll send it to your professors. We hope that you received something valuable from our talk today and just want to provide a way for you to react in response to this information. Also, will be provided in the live chat. There's a link to a page where you can be a part of the great things that Convoy of Hope is doing in this time. There's an opportunity to donate to the Convoy of Hope Crisis Relief Fund that was created as a COVID-19 response. We just want to provide this tangible way that you can take this information and directly apply it to your life. And we just believe that Convoy of Hope is doing some incredible work in communities across the world and want you to be able to be a part of it. So again, thank you for attending our 2020 Community Night, VolunTRUTHism, a conversation on ethical